SABC News podcasts, breaking news, entertainment, and more. First Take SA, update at noon, and the Weekend View on SAFM. Find us wherever you listen to your podcasts. sabcnews.com, keeping you informed.
South Africa's budget process has been thrown into uncertainty after the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, scrapped plans for the 0.5% increase in value-added tax. The move has sparked mixed reactions from politicians. The ANC welcomed the decision, calling for more inclusive fiscal policy, while the EFF has hailed it a victory, but is demanding the Finance Minister's resignation and a complete overhaul of the budget process. For more on this, we're joined on the line by the EFF Senior Researcher, Dr. Gumani Tshimomola. A very good morning to you, Doctor, and welcome.
Well, good morning to Elvis and SAFM listeners, and thank you for inviting us.
You've called for the resignation of the Finance Minister and the Director General of the National Treasury, citing their handling of the budget process as a threat to economic stability. So tell us, what specific policy failures or decisions by these officials does the EFF believe have contributed to this threat, and who would the EFF recommend as a suitable replacement?
So absolutely. You know, in any other society that takes itself serious, a minister who was given a very strict deadline by legislation, which is the PFMA, that says that a minister must table a budget before the end of the financial year, would have resigned if they failed to do that, because a budget is such an important government instrument to ensure that there's continuity of service delivery, there's certainty in the economy and the market, business people know what they're dealing with. But in this instance, both the minister and the Director General of the National Treasury, Duncan, are unable to present a credible, believable, and also a budget that will find consensus in the National Assembly and in the National Council of Provinces. And we call for his resignation because as things stand now, on this particular day, 25 April, South Africa does not have a budget before Parliament, which we can analyze, interrogate, agree, disagree, because he has withdrawn everything that he has tabled as a budget, except the fiscal framework, which was already adopted and was challenging in court. Now, in terms of the proposal, from the beginning when the first budget was tabled in Feb, Elvis, if you remember, immediately after the failure to convene that sitting, the EFF went outside and said, we have looked at the proposal. Firstly, we reject the proposal of 2% point VAT increase. And then we also made some criticism of certain areas, spending cuts, expenditure increase that were below inflation, the issue of the conditional grants that are not being spent but also being mismanaged. And we said that let's look at this budget as a tool that must respond to the economic crisis, a deep economic crisis that is not giving us growth, it is not giving us jobs. And more South Africans have become poor. We need to treat this budget as a response to a crisis and make it a stimulus budget. In our proposal to Parliament, to the Minister of Finance and the ANC, we said, like what happened during COVID, when we had that health crisis threatening livelihood and lives, we injected money in the economy, whether it was used correctly or not. That's a separate and a different matter. But in this instance, our argument was that let's inject roughly around 500 billion in this budget. Let's forget for now about what the National Treasury is calling fiscal anchors, where their main priority and obsession is to make sure that they achieve some level of a budget primary surplus. Let's put that aside because it's not helping. You are simply taking away the money from the economy that is much needed to be able to drive this economy and revive it, instead of going towards the direction of 1% GDP growth by the end of this year. Let's put money in the economy. Let's explore other monetary instruments at the Reserve Bank. Let's look at all the surpluses that are sitting in different government-controlled institutions, the Competition Fund, the Skills Fund, the National Unemployment Insurance, the UIF, and everything else. Let's put it together as one. Let's not separate the fiscal policy with the monetary policy, and come back with a crisis-responding budget that will bring the fiscal stimulus.
Yes.
The Parliamentary Budget Office agrees with us. The Financial and Fiscal Commission agrees with the EFF. And majority of the submissions during the public hearings, more than 90% of them, are saying the same thing. With the crisis, we need a budget that will respond, grow the economy, create jobs, and then also rebuild the capacity of the state. We don't understand why the minister and the DG are so reluctant to use this responsibility productively to grow the economy, and hence we call for their resignation.
All right. Now, you've also called for the adoption of the 2025 fiscal framework illegal due to procedural irregularities. Can you specify which aspects of the Money Bill Amendments procedure as well as the Related Matters Act were violated during the adoption process, how these violations undermine legitimacy of the fiscal framework, and are there any legal challenges being considered here?
So I think what is important for SAFM listeners, and I'm glad that I've been in this platform to explain this before, and since the court case now, there seems to be some appreciation of what we're saying. Simply put, when you go to the Standing Committee on Finance meeting to consider the fiscal framework tabled by the Minister of Finance, it remains a proposal, and that's important. A proposal is something that you must take into account, look at your views, other people's views, and then amend it. And in this instance, the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters of 2009, Section 8.4, it says that a Standing Committee on Finance must explicitly state whether they accept or they amend the fiscal framework as tabled by the minister in a form of proposal. When we went to that meeting, it started at 10. We raised this issue to the chair of the committee, Dr. Maswangani, to say, Dr. Maswangani, as the chair of the committee, it will be appropriate for you to put a question on the table, on the meeting, to say, are we amending or are we accepting the fiscal framework as it is? And once we take that decision, whether we're amending or we're accepting as it is, it will then inform the report that we want to produce and then table in the National Assembly. He rejected that without reason. And at some point, we even came to a conclusion that he was interacting with this clause, Section 8.4 of the money bills for the first time. Because the ANC has enjoyed majority in the last 30 years in Parliament, and they've bulldozed certain legislation as party lines without engaging other parties. And the EFF has been raising this point since 2014 to say that Parliament has the powers to amend the legislation, to amend the proposals by the Minister of Finance. And let's not keep saying that people must go to the Treasury to ask for this, we must ask the Treasury for this. As members of Parliament with the power to do so, let's use the money bills and let's amend what has been put before. He rejected that in the morning, midday, took a long break to go and consult with the lawyers. Even after that, he never came to the committee and put a question to say, are we clearly accepting or amending? Instead, they fudged the process, hoodwinked other political parties who at that time who believed they didn't understand the process. To this day, there are still people who are not willing to follow the process. So I think it was clear in court when the arguments were being presented that there was no reason for the chair of the committee to do what he did. But subsequently, even the speaker, you may have heard the judges said, why did the speaker not just listen to the recording? Because she would have realized that the procedure was not followed. And I can tell you now, I saw yesterday the Minister of Finance has introduced a piece of legislation trying to reverse the bill. The VAT rate 0.5 increase, and it was released late in the evening. Now, if in that legislation, I can tell you now, Elvis, the way they're introducing it, they are going to find themselves in the same legal quagmire, because the legislation, the very same money bills that we're talking about, it says that this revenue bill, this rate and monetary amendment bill that they want to introduce, must be consistent with the fiscal framework. And the EFF argument and contention is that we don't have a fiscal framework as it stands. So why do you then go and introduce a new legislation of rate and monetary amendment? But we appreciate the desperation and the crisis. No one wants a VAT increase. We'll all be better off without the 0.5 percentage point VAT increase. But let's just find a legally sound mechanism to be able to reverse that without wanting to score political point. We may not be able to do it before the 1st of May. It's okay. But I think society now has come on board to appreciate that the minister has considered that it was ill-conceived, it was misguided, and he has withdrew it. But we are calling for the withdrawal of that and his own resignation. Who becomes the Minister of Finance later on, the ANC can decide. But they can appreciate that they need someone who's competent, agile,
just
and
very
be
briefly,
able to put a sound policy.
Doctor, just very briefly, the 0.5% increase in value-added tax has been scrapped for now. What about next year? Because it was 0.5 this year and 0.5 next year.
That's the problem. It's not scrapped even now. What is happening is that there's a legislation amending process happening in Parliament. And I think we must get clarity from both the National Treasury and Parliament. Are they saying that because there's an introduction of a bill that has not been signed by a president yet? Remember, a bill is only a legal instrument once it's enacted and signed by the president. At the moment, there's just an introduction of a proposal that must still serve before the Standing Committee on Finance.
You said it is a problem. It needs to go back because that 0%, that 0.5% for next year has not been addressed.
For a moment, for argument's sake, and to make sense to the listeners of SFM, let's first deal with what is important with Parliament is that we work within the rules in the legislation. When I went to sleep last night, there's something called Rates and Monetary Amounts and Amendment of Revenue Law Bill. That was tabled by the Minister of Finance. It's introduced in the National Assembly. Now, what is introduced in the National Assembly deals with both this year and next year, essentially, right? So the minister is saying that I don't want to increase VAT by 0.5 now and 2026. And we accept that, and that's what we have called for. I think you will not find any person arguing against that. But the challenge that we're going to have, and I want to illustrate why there's some sense of desperation, and it will lead us into the same problem. The Money Bills Amendment Procedure, Section 11, it says that the revenue bill, which include what the ministers tabled, must be referred to the Committee on Finance, which is the Standing Committee on Finance, for consideration and the report. And then what is important here is that in amending revenue bills, the Revenue Proposal Parliament and its committees must also hold public hearings. And that's very important. It must hold public hearings on the revenue bills, which this is one of them. And then only once you have done that exercise, you sit as the committee, you generate a report, and then you say, okay, we're fine with this. And then the minister, if you are amending what he has proposed, must be given 14 days to respond. Now, where I'm stuck is I don't think you can do that process before the 1st of May, because today is the 25th of April. We attended a meeting yesterday, a National Assembly Programming Committee, chaired by Frolik, the chair of chairs, Honorable Frolik. And Parliament adopted a report which has maintained the week that is coming, 28, 29, up until the 1st of May, as a leave week, because you will appreciate that we're going to observe Freedom Day on the 28th, and then on the 1st of May, it's Workers' Day. So when do you do public hearings in that week so that the bill that you've proposed, which will only come into effect once it's signed by the president, is then taken through public hearings, then there's a committee report, and that committee report is sent to the National Assembly for adoption. It goes to the NCOP, who must do the same thing, public hearings, and finalize it, and then you're able to send it to the president for signing. You have effectively, you have 2 days. You have 29, 30, and then the 1st of May is a holiday. And then you want to tell South Africans that on the 1st of May, there will not be a VAT increase based on a bill. That is illegal.
So what specific steps should the Minister of Finance now take to ensure that the new fiscal framework, the Division of Revenue Bill that you're referring to, and the Appropriations Bill align with constitutional as well as the legal requirements, particularly under Section 27 of the Public Finance Management Act?
So, firstly, let's all accept that we need a reset. I think that's what the SG of the ANC said yesterday. We accept that, and we must all welcome that step. Now, Section 27 of the PFMA says that the minister must introduce a budget. And in that budget, there must be a fiscal framework, there must be division of revenue bill, there must be appropriation, and there must be revenue amendments. And there's a simple reason why there's a chronological ordering of this thing in this way. The fiscal framework gives you the overall plan. You can't work without an overall plan. The division of revenue gives you the allocation between spheres of government. You need that so that you are able to go and process your appropriation bill. And then once you are done with your appropriation bill, you can then go and start now fixing the legislation required for you to collect the money, which is not revenue bills. We're saying that let's go back to tabling as a whole the budget. You will see we wrote to the Speaker yesterday asking her what is the status of the fiscal framework, because that was already adopted by the National Assembly. However, even though we are challenging it, we need to still answer as to whether the withdrawal of the division of revenue bill and the appropriation bill in effect also withdraws the fiscal framework. But we don't want to assume. What we are confident about, and which we think that a new Minister of Finance will be able to do, is to table a budget in its totality, not a piece of legislation out of a desperation to try and align with a meeting that took place in Sandton. And that meeting took place in Sandton, not in Parliament. And now you want to take a meeting outside of Parliament to come and fit it into the parliamentary process when Parliament is guided by law. Once the minister has tabled a new budget in its totality, we then go back to the Standing Committee on Finance quickly. And then we can even do this during the week. After the 1st of May, that following week of May, we can do it quickly, convene Parliament, the minister introduce the budget on the 6th, although it's late because the budget is supposed to be tabled before the 31st of March. But we appreciate the circumstances anyway. We table the budget on the 6th of May. We go to the Standing Committee on Finance, hold public hearings that entire week. I can promise you now, before the 15th of May, we would have adopted the fiscal framework in Parliament if everyone is working together in a much more coordinated way following the rules. And once we adopt the fiscal framework, it is then that the minister will be able to then bring the revenue bill that he wants to reverse the VAT. So he was correct. The Treasury mentioned that it may take a month or two to reverse this 0.5% increase. And we were comfortable with that, thinking that he's respecting these processes. But now, the speed at which this thing is happening and the rush and trying to manage seemingly political perception, they will just end up in the same place where they are now, both in court and in meetings trying to convince their stakeholders that they are doing this thing properly when they are not, and they will only come back later, June, July, to then try and reverse the process again. And what is important, Elvis, about Parliament is that you are not guaranteed continuity as government if you don't pass a budget. There was once a pamphlet in Parliament website, which they've now removed, I can't find. That pamphlet clearly states that should a government fail to pass a budget after a certain period, which will likely be July and possibly August, if people are pushing the envelope, you need to resign as government and elect a new government. It is the law. It is not a political negotiation like they did with the statement of intent that now it's what has formulated the GNU, or the conversation that happened now in Sandton where they agreed to reverse VAT. They said it will not come into effect the 1st of May, regardless of legislation. Parliament is bound by rules and legislation, and we must follow that. It's extremely important. So we think that we must go back to reset. Let's start the process again from the beginning.
There needs to be a reset because the National Treasury also estimate a 75 billion rand revenue shortfall over 3 years due to the scrapping of the VAT hike. So what alternative revenue-raising measures does the EFF propose to address the shortfall while avoiding regressive taxes that disproportionately affect the poor?
No, I'm glad you're asking that because, frankly, the EFF presented this in the very first meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance who adopted the fiscal framework. We gave our proposals to the Minister and the ANC. Firstly, we need to go back and look at corporate income tax. South African corporations are not taxed what they should be taxed. particularly because majority of them, we believe, are engaged in illicit financial flows, base erosion, and aggressive tax avoidance. So there was a time when the tax rate was reduced by 1%, and we were never given a sound and believable explanation as to why that is the case. And firstly, our proposal is that it must go back to the rate that it was before it was reduced by 1 percentage point. But after that, in the following year, we must then adjust it again to a point of 30% corporate income tax. Secondly, we need to consider various tax instruments to tax the rich, and we can call it wealth tax in a number of ways. We need to talk about this wealth tax thing because since 1994, there's been calls for wealth tax because South Africa is one of the most unequal society in the world, the highest inequality that is racially based. Majority of the people who own the resources, means of production and enjoy opulence in South Africa are white, while majority of black people are suffering. So a wealth tax is both historically correct, morally correct, and government has an obligation to then impose it. We're not talking about the kind of things that they say is wealth tax now. We're talking about taxing the rich that even their wealth, when you look at it, it brings into question certain things, which brings me to the third proposal. We are saying let's look into an apartheid tax because we understand that just before the eve of the transition to this democracy, there was a lot of trust and land that was transferred to individuals, some of it from the state. These trusts were created to hide the wealth that was gained during apartheid. And what was apartheid? Apartheid was an economy that dehumanized black people, dispossessed them of land, refused their participation meaningfully in the economy, except exploitation as cheap labor. Now, there has to be some form of contribution to rebuilding the society by those who deliberately went and hidden their wealth in these various tax instruments, particularly trusts that were created before 1994. And we are proposing a once-off moral taxation of those institutions. And we know that many of them are still existing. They've accumulated a lot of wealth today. Then the other proposals we're making is that there are land holdings that are there at the moment. And those land holdings are considered luxurious land holdings. And they are not being used productively, but they are just being used for speculative market trading. And some of them are used for surety when individuals go and borrow money from the bank. Now, we're saying that if you have a stand in Clifton, Cape Town, beachfront, the land is valued there at 9 million. It's empty simply because it's next to other nice properties, nice location. We agree. But if you are not using it and you're just sitting on that piece of land, we must tax you because if there was a property there, we're going to be taxing you far much higher for property rate and taxes. So those are some of the instruments that we need to look into. But when you talk about revenue shortfall, Elvis, we're not limited to the idea of just plugging the hole of the 75 billion that the minister is complaining about. So let's at least appreciate that the 75 billion, where it comes from, the DG of Treasury, Duncan, has come up with something that I don't even think it's scientific. He calls it a fiscal anchor in his budget. So a fiscal anchor, according to Duncan, is that if you collect a certain number of revenue, let's say 10 rand, you must allocate expenditure, non-tax, non-debt service expenditure. You must allocate 9 rand so that you are left with what he calls a primary surplus. So that in long term, whatever primary surplus you have, you are then able to use it to reduce your overall debt. In paper, it sounds perfect. But the reality is that you can't do it in an economy that has grown by 1% or less than 1% in the last 10 years. You can't do it. You can't do it in an economy that you are projecting to grow potentially by 1.8% over the medium term. When the reality is that you are sitting with over 40% of unemployment, this is more than 12 million people who are unemployed. You are not producing anything. Government is not growing. Government is not building at a fast rate required infrastructure. You can't hire doctors. You can't hire teachers. And then when you drive around metropolitan cities, the infrastructure is just being dilapidated. And we're happy that you are only adding about 42 billion additional expenditure on infrastructure. It's not fast enough. You need to reboot the economy, and you can't reboot the economy over a long term of period. Rebooting of an economy is like when you want to revive a person who's struggling to breathe and they are possibly in a risk of losing their life. And there's some instrument that those of us who have watched a lot of medical series will see. They just take them, rub them together, and electrify a person so that they revive your heart rate.
Yes.
That's what you need to this economy. You can't do that process over 7 days. A person will be dead. So by the time the Treasury want to revive this economy through this prolonged period of low spending of government, relying on private sector, and then hoping that there'll be jobs, it's not going to help. You will plunge this country into a civil war because poor economic growth, high levels of unemployment, high levels of inequality are in a way national economic security threats. Yes. And you need to deal with them decisively. That's what we're dealing with. And I don't think the DG of Treasury will bring any believable plan around that because he has a certain level of orthodoxy belief that is guiding him in terms of what he wants to do. The Treasury must not have an expansionary fiscal policy. The Treasury must not link the fiscal policy with monetary policy. The Treasury must just be content with managing the debt, sell the bonds in the bond market, raise the deficit that he needs through borrowings, and continue with business as usual. And hope that the private sector, through their participation in a public-private partnership, will revive the profitability and then will create jobs. I can tell you now, the private sector, even in the next 30 years, is not in a capacity to save the South African situation. It needs the state at the forefront of this battle.
We started off the conversation, Doctor, with the EFF calling for the resignation of the minister, and you didn't answer the question, who would the EFF recommend as a suitable replacement?
Well, it's a difficult one to say who must replace the current minister. But we can be confident that this current one, he looks tired. He doesn't look like he's managing the stakeholders properly. We were told in court that he even used deceitful tactics to get people to agree with him. So once we agree on he must go, then the African National Congress must apply its mind. I mean, look, if we had a choice, we'll say all of them must go as cabinet and the president. That's why we contest election. But we're just dealing with a particular problem here of a minister who's failing to table a budget that is an important instrument, and he has that constitutional and legal obligation. What is even more painful is that the Constitution Section 73 says that no one else except the Minister of Finance is the one who can table budget instrument in the form of money bills. So you can appreciate that we are well within our rights to call for his resignation. But to then go and suggest who must become a Minister of Finance, I think it will be overstepping on our part. In that regard, and will allow the ANC to then go and find each other in this regard. It's not, we just left with some few years before we go to elections. Perhaps when we contest and call for all of them to go, you will appreciate that next time when we call for someone's resignation, it's not because we're interested in terms of who must come in and occupy which position. So I feel that it's sufficient enough for us to call for his resignation without necessarily call. If you were asking me, who should be the Director General of the Treasury? Perhaps I can have a different conversation with you in that regard.
Maybe you could share it.
No, absolutely. The National Treasury needs, first of all, someone who understands its historical context. The National Treasury does not operate as independent from the politics and the legal demands that any government should fulfill and comply with, which are in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, and we know what they are. We need a Director General and a team, the leadership team of the Treasury, that appreciate that their primary and most urgent task is to put a budget that talks to jobs and growth in a very obvious and tangible way. And those comrades currently sitting at the Treasury are not interested in that. They have not been interested for the past 30 years. And we have argued this in every budget speech. So you need a Director General who will admittedly publicly say that the budget that we are going to draft and propose to Parliament first is going to respond to jobs, and this is how many jobs we are going to produce. And in that way, this is the kind of economic growth we are going to look for. Currently, the National Treasury does not even begin to give you that. If you look at the immediate obsession now, which is Operation Vulindlela. They call it a strategy to implement structural reforms, which we call it a blueprint of privatization. When you look at that document, they say that they want to create 1 million jobs once they're done implementing this program. How do you implement what you consider your biggest problem, your biggest policy intervention in a form of structural reform? And then at the end of it, all you want is 1 million jobs. When there are 12 million people who are unemployed, that should tell you that they have no appreciation of the relationship between the instrument they have in the form of budget and what it should achieve in terms of giving us jobs. It's nothing personal. It's just that the collective that is there now is the one that has given us this result. You can argue that the current DG was not there. He just got appointed recently, but the former DGs will have told you the same thing that I'm telling you now. They never saw the budget as an instrument that must be linked with jobs. It must be linked with economic growth.
So who's the replacement?
The desperation is just to balance it, have a primary budget surplus, make the bond sellable in the market so that they're able to raise the deficit that they are worried about.
So, Doctor, who is the replacement for the DG?
We must do an advert. I'll possibly to be one of the people who must apply there now that it looks like we're dealing with a crisis, but I'm just joking. It should be a public, open process. We must not take an IMF recommendation or an IMF-trained person who comes with a particular conservatism that will then hinder and limit the work of the National Treasury. But we need a progressive, more forward-looking, but someone who understands and appreciates the agency we're dealing with.
Doctor, I thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for the invitation.
That was the EFF Senior Researcher, Dr. Gumani Tshimamola.
SABC News podcasts, breaking news, entertainment, and more. First Take SA, update at noon and the weekend view on SAFM.